is Tigran Haas, and I'm the director of the Center for the Future of Places, which is based in our School of Architecture and the Built Environment. And as some of you might know, we have a whole plethora of different events. Even we have something which is called a dictionary of events with all these different Greek symbols. But this is kind of maybe my favorite one because, as you can see on the screen, it's a special Ideapolis exchanges colloquium where we take up on a subject or a cluster of subjects that are, I wouldn't call them controversial, but that are hard topic issues and where we can speak about them openly. Where we sort of break the boundaries, deconstruct issues, and then promote an inclusive, enriching culture of dialogue. So for those occasions, we invite a selected few number of speakers. So I think if you remember a couple months ago, we had Srećko Horvat, a philosopher, writer from Croatia. And now, tonight, we have Professor Julian Agyeman from Tufts University. And I could go on about Julian for quite a long time, but I'm not going to do that. But he's an old friend of ours because you've been in Sweden before. And I just can show you this slide. And maybe this is my favorite picture of you, so I always use this one. But Julian is a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts, part of Boston, basically. And he's the originator of the concept of just sustainabilities, and that platform has spin off all these marvelous publications that are based on research, and you can see all these books, and one of the latest one is The Food Trucks, Cultural Identity and Social Justice that came out recently, and you had a book release in McGill where you have been the visiting professor on your sabbatical the last year. Some of us know, and especially my colleague Karen Bradley, know Julian's work all the way back to the environmental justice issues, where you've done a lot of work, and then later on through Just Sustainabilities, and one of those really nice bestsellers, The Just Cities, which you did with your colleague Duncan. You were trained in the UK initially in geography and botany, because you spoke today about your love for nature. So now we have more, we have still love for nature, but we have, I guess, fear and anger to do something about nature, which is sort of under threat. And finally, urban studies. So you combine really interesting subjects that our school, and especially our Department of Urban Planning and Environment, is almost founded on. If you can read quite a lot about Julian, and he's one of those best Twitter people in the field, so you can always also connect to him through Twitter and go on Google Scholar and find some of the fantastic articles that Julian has written within all these. And I think I missed one of the books in these pictures. I have a feeling one is missing. I can't remember which one. But, and you told me once on the Future Places conference that we were speaker together with Saskia Sass and Richard Sennett, if you show this for 40 seconds, 20% of the people in the audience will buy these books afterwards. So it's been there for 40 seconds. Last but not least, each of these Ideapolis talks or colloquiums were followed by a wonderful panel. So this time around, we have a panel of my colleagues and friends, Associate Professor Karen Bradley from the Department of Urban Planning and Environment, Professor Matthias Höjer from the Department of SEED, beautiful acronym, but I know it stands for many things, but it does, okay? And last but not least, Assistant Professor Andrew Carvin, and also from the Department of Urban Planning and Environment. And the idea is that Julian gives a talk, and then we have this interesting reflective discussion amongst the panel, and we open up for the Q&A at the end. So Julian, welcome back to Stockholm.
Thank you, Tigran, and thank you, Stockholm, and well, thank you for coming on a night like this. I was sort of reminded of a talk I was giving in Vancouver, and if any of you have been to Vancouver, when it's sunny, people get outside, because it's not sunny a huge amount of the time. So it was a beautiful sunny summer's evening, and the Canucks were playing at home, the ice hockey team, and I thought there'd be nobody there, but there was a great audience like you, so I'm happy with that. Introducing Just Sustainabilities, policy, planning and practice. Well, the most important thing here actually is the Twitter handle, so do feel free to tweet. Hashtag Just Sustainabilities, all one word, if you find something that is controversial, interesting, or just downright, thought-provoking, then yeah, please do tweet it. Let me start with one thought. If we went out onto the streets of Stockholm today and asked, what is sustainability? I would say 9 out of 10, if not 10 out of 10 people would say, well, it's about the environment. And of course it is about the environment. It's It's about how we can imagine and live for a better future and in a better future. But we could prescribe a green planet. We could have regulations, but if these planetary ideas weren't socially just, would we have a sustainable planet? So I think in many ways, when we talk about sustainability, and certainly when I started thinking about this 20, 30 years ago, there is what I call an equity deficit to much sustainability thinking. This is the book you forgot, by the way. So this is the book that started me on this journey to think about just sustainabilities. This was 2003, Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World. And in this book, we really started to think about the relationship between environmental quality and human equality. This was the first book really to focus explicitly on equity and justice within sustainability discourses. And this relationship between environmental quality and human equality, I think, is interesting. When you think about social movement organizations and environmental quality, you think Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, you think of these green groups. When you think about human equality, you think Amnesty International. Why do we separate environmental quality and human equality? We've failed in both because we have separated them. We have this reductionist idea that we need to separate out. Oh, Julian, we're an environmental organization. We're absolutely all behind social justice, but that's mission creep. No, it's not. It's mission support. I actually think that if environmental organizations had taken on a social justice function and human rights organizations had understood the importance of environmental quality and conditions, they would have been more effective. Let me give you an example, 2 examples. Some of us are old enough to remember 1988, Ken Saro-Wiwa. Ken Saro-Wiwa was an Ogoni, Nigerian human rights and environmental campaigner in the Niger Delta. Environmental organizations called him a green campaigner. The social justice organizations said he was a human rights campaigner. He was both. After his death, they formed the Ogoni Human Rights and Environment Organization. He was both. In 1988 also, the death of Chico Mendes was announced. Chico Mendes was a rainforest campaigner, and again, the environmentalists said he was a rainforest campaigner. The social justice people said, well, actually, he was a union organizer for the Rubber Tappers Union and a human rights. He was both, of course. My point is, environmental quality and human equality are inextricably interlinked. And we need to get that message, I think, much clearer. So we came up with this idea then that sustainability can't simply be a green or environmental concern, important though green and environmental concerns are. A truly sustainable society, we were arguing, is one where wider questions of social needs and welfare and economic opportunity are integrally related to ideas of environmental limits. So that was our starting point, really. And then building from that platform, we came up with a definition that just sustainabilities is the need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And there are 4 conditions then of a just sustainability. 1, improving our quality of life and well-being. 2, meeting the needs of both present and future generations, both intra and intergenerational equity. Justice and equity in terms of recognition, process, procedure and outcome. Recognition. This has become, I think, a very much more important issue over the last 10, 15 years. We used to talk about justice in terms of distribution, who gets what, and process, who gets access to making decisions. But people like Dave Schlossberg, now in Australia, said recognition is a form of justice. And in the US at the moment, we have the best example of a cry for recognition in the Black Lives Matter movement. Recognition is also about reconciliation. First Nations, Aboriginal peoples. If we don't recognise the rights to exist, there can be no form of justice. So recognition is, I think, a very important part of the Just Sustainabilities analysis of justice. Living within ecosystem limits, again, is the umbilical link between us and the planet. So let me now just pull away from just sustainabilities and into urban planning, which is obviously where I work, and many of you are in urban planning. And I want, through this talk, to try and explore two key challenges. There are many challenges, but I've kind of distilled them down to two for the purposes of this talk. My favourite definition of urban planning, and it fits within this just sustainabilities notion, is urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. Coexistence in shared space. That's what we do. That's what we should be doing. How do we manage our coexistence in shared space? Leonie Sandercock at UBC takes this a stage further. She says this definition speaks with equal clarity about environmental, transport, housing, and other conflicts, reminding us that whether we like it or not, we do share space on this planet with others who in many ways are not like us, and we need to find ways of coexisting in these spaces from the next door neighbour to the street, neighbourhood, city, and the region. It would be easy to plan cities if we were all the same, if we all looked alike, ate alike, made love alike, did everything alike. But we're not one public, we are multiple publics. We exist in cities of difference, cities and places where we're in the presence of otherness. How do we plan for multiple publics? And I'm going to come on to look at this in more detail. How do we plan for multiple publics when many of us don't look like the publics we're going to be planning for and with? That's a real problem. Now, the second challenge then, and this is something that is blowing my mind at the moment, and it's in part because I'm on sabbatical in Canada, a country that, compared to a lot of other countries, is at least talking about recognition and reconciliation with First Nations people, as is Australia. And it's this idea of belonging. So my problem at the moment is that we as planners, we as urban builders, we as city builders, are better at developing prescriptions for what our cities can become, smart, sharing, resilient, sustainable, than we are at fostering belonging, recognition, reconciliation, difference, diversity, and inclusion. Just sustainabilities is about humane scale as opposed to solely human scale planning. I think we need to think of both belonging and becoming together. Why is that important? Well, if we don't think of these things together, it will be the same elite group of people who get to prescribe what we can become. We need to open up belonging so that we can have a bigger discussion about the kind of cities we want. And this is, I think, really important, the relationship between belonging and becoming. And think deep down into your souls. Think about the education you're getting in urban planning or design. It's much more focused on becoming than on who belongs. And I'm going to revisit this theme, or all of these themes, as I go through my talk. So I want to give 3 examples and really spend the rest of my time talking about these examples. Again, I could go into the theoretical background of just sustainabilities more. You can read about that in any one of a number of books that you've seen, and you will see again and again and again until you go online and buy them. So I'm going to give 3 examples. The first one I want to look at is this concept of spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? Again, who belongs? Who belongs? Culture, difference, and diversity. How do we recognize, understand, and engage difference, diversity, and cultural heterogeneity in inclusive, creative, and productive ways? And finally, I'll then come on to some newer work that I've done. Tigran says, say something new. Okay, Tigran, sharing cities. I'm going to talk about the sharing cities work, which I don't think you have heard. So let me talk first then about this concept of spatial justice. It's very interesting. When I do this talk in American audiences, I ask the audience the following question: who grew up in a community with a river, a railway line, a freeway, or some other landscape feature, and you lived on one side and they lived on the other side? At least 60% of people put their hands up. America is still a very segregated society. We don't have necessarily walls in cities like they do in Jerusalem or Nicosia or they did in Belfast, but there are lines. We have spatially unjust cities. And David Lammy, the British Member of Parliament, I think describes it very well. Just as social justice requires that life chances are not distributed along class lines, spatial justice requires that they are not distributed geographically. Spatializing justice. And what I want to do is think through this concept of spatial justice in terms of our streets, parks, and other spaces that we use on a regular basis. So first of all, let's think about urban streets. And you have two streets here, Södervägen in Gothenburg, and closer to my home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you have Massachusetts Avenue. The two streets are identical width, but they couldn't look more different. There are great issues of spatial justice and injustice in these streets. On the street on the right, and let me just frame this by saying Cambridge, Massachusetts is probably, along with Berkeley, California, the most liberal and progressive city in the United States. It's the home of Harvard and MIT. It's a very, very nice place to live. And yet our roads look like that. What is the principle of allocation of space on US roads? What is the principle there? The bigger your vehicle, the more rights you have. That's the American way, I'm afraid. You can laugh when I say things like that. It's true. I mean, that is the principle there. That's organized chaos, basically. And there are actually bike lanes on either side. This is Cambridge, Mass. I mean, we're trying to do things. But there are actually bike lanes, which is crazy. I mean, you can't see them, but they are actually there. On the left, you have the democratized street. You have a more spatially just street. The only place where private vehicles are allowed is about 10 or 15% of the street space. The rest is given over to human forms of transportation, to streetcars. My question in this, democratization versus organized chaos, how does the kid grow up in those two different streets? How does a child grow up differently wired? You come out of your house every day, and remember, the street is the public space, and streets are public spaces. The street is the public space we use every single day. How are you differently wired as a child growing up on Massachusetts Avenue versus Södervägen? How are you differently wired as an adult when you see aggression on the right and a more orderly way of moving around on the left? Now, we do have some data. We have quite a lot of data from Appleyard's work in the late 70s, early 80s. We know that car traffic decreases social interaction. Appleyard looked at heavily trafficked streets, moderately trafficked streets, and lightly trafficked streets. And on the lightly trafficked streets, he found that there was more social interaction and people had more friendships than on heavily trafficked streets. Who lives on lightly trafficked streets compared to heavily trafficked streets? There's a socioeconomic, and in the US, I'm afraid, a racial aspect to this. If you look at low-income and minority neighborhoods, you're much more likely to find heavily trafficked streets, larger roads, than the traffic-calmed, lightly trafficked, walkable, cyclable streets in middle and upper middle-class neighborhoods. We are trying in the US. I mean, this is Times Square and Broadway outside of Macy's. This is actually, I think, quite an important development. Mayor Bloomberg hired a very talented transportation commissioner, Janet Siddiq Khan. She brought in Jan Gale of the Copenhagen Miracle. They brought in the civil society actors from around New York, transportation justice, environmental justice, the cyclists, and they formed a coalition to get this done. And this reminds me, looking at these pictures, urban planning should be about what is possible, not what is probable. This doesn't happen. Congestion charging in London doesn't happen. The High Line in New York doesn't happen if we probably do what we've always done. It takes people who think things are possible to get things done. And I want you to remember that. But more often, we are more likely to use our design skills to say you don't belong. The so-called hostile and defensive architecture. On the top left, we have the studs put on there to stop kids skateboarding. In the middle there, we have the bench where those armrests look nice and benign, but they're to stop homeless people sleeping there. Or we have really brutal studs, which stop homeless people sleeping. We have the rich door, poor door. I don't know whether you have this in Stockholm, but certainly in London and New York, where a developer gets to build a sizable building, you have to put in a certain amount of lower income or affordable housing, and some of them have been building doors around the back for the poorer people, whilst the richer people can go in through the rich doors. My favourite of these, though, is this one on the bottom left. I cannot believe this. Seattle prides itself on greenness. Seattle is in the Pacific Northwest. You know, the idea of environment kind of pervades a lot of policy making. They've been very progressive. But this is the most cynical use of sustainability infrastructure I've ever come across. The use of sustainability or biking infrastructure to prevent homeless people from sleeping under a bridge. Kudos to the cycling community in Seattle who said, hey, whoa, we have a problem, Seattle. We have a problem with homelessness, but don't use cycling infrastructure to try and do something that needs really, some serious policy and some serious thinking about. I'm going to come back again to that because sustainability is a very contested concept in many ways, and so let's bear that in mind as we start to think about this idea of belonging. And somebody made a call, somebody made a policy or planning decision or a political decision to decide who belongs in certain urban environments. So again, this point about belonging and becoming is very important. The right to the city, all of these kind of things are part of this same debate about belonging and becoming. Now, one of the really interesting ideas coming out of sociology at the moment, my friend Elijah Anderson at Yale University has a very interesting concept and book, and notice I do advertise other people's books. I would really recommend reading this. This is called The Cosmopolitan Canopy, Race and Civility in Everyday Life. Elijah's basic thesis is we walk down the streets most days trying studiously to avoid other people's eyes. We try to avoid people smiling here. Yeah, we do. We don't want to look at people. You catch somebody's eye, they think you're a nutter or something like that, or you want something, or you're going to do something. But there are places, Elijah says, and this is especially racialized, this as well. I mean, when white folks do it, it's one thing, but it can take on racial overtones when it's done in certain contexts. But Elijah's point is there are places in cities that he calls cosmopolitan canopies. Places where we are more civil. We let down our guard. We can look at people. We can say, hey, what's that sauce you've got on your Philly cheesesteak? We can ask questions to the Greek woman or the Jewish woman or the African American guy or the Irish guy. We can talk about sports, we can talk about food. Now, number one, food is really important. A lot of my work, actually, that's another point. Cultivating Food Justice wasn't up there. Tigran, that's 2 books you missed. Go to the back of the class, Tigran. So food is really important, and I mean really important, if we want to create spaces of engagement. This is a space of engagement. You can see people sitting there in markets. We are there to discuss food. Food is really, really important. Question for me, though, is there a role for us as planners, urban designers, in creating cosmopolitan canopies? Do they just happen, sort of organically? Sorry about that, organic and food, but do they just happen organically, or is there a role for us as urban planners in creating them or the conditions by which they arise? And here's another example. Children are very good at helping us. So food and children, very good at helping us come together and talk. And especially in places like that, parks, or I've noticed in Boston, where there's those water fountains, where the water flies up. The kids love those, the parents, the guardians sit around, and they end up talking to each other. But these spaces of engagement are very rare in our cities. Spaces of engagement, spaces where we can encounter difference in a friendly, convivial atmosphere. How do we create these spaces of engagement? That's a spatial justice issue. Now, in the US, we do have, or the new urbanists are pushing a complete streets agenda. The idea, and who can disagree with the idea of complete streets? The idea that streets are for people, streets aren't just for cars, and virtually every community in the US now has a complete streets design guide. Swampscott, Massachusetts, which is just up the coast from where I am, the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, Somerville, Massachusetts, which is where Tufts University is, and then on the right, City of Toronto, Canada. Everybody has got these complete streets design manuals. But, the question for me is, can this complete streets discourse, the design manuals, the policies, the regulatory structures, reverse the inequalities of car-centric planning? Because we know in the United States who bore the brunt of car-centric policies. It was people without cars and people whose neighborhoods were riven apart by freeways and other structures for suburban people to get in and out quickly. So one of the things that I think about, though, is, are streets physical spaces or are they social constructs? And, we as planners intervene often in the physical structure. And Doreen Massey, a geographer, I think helps us out here. She says places, and I see streets as places, have no fixed meaning. Rather, they are, quote, constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. Streets are ecologies. They are social spaces. Yet, nearly all of what I see in my students' research into the complete streets concept is that it is physically focused. Its rhetoric disconnects streets from their significant social, structural, symbolic, discursive, and historical realities. And on the left, we have a street in Athens. You can't design that. That's something that happens. It was bizarre, actually. I gave this lecture in Sheffield in the UK, and a student put a hand up and said, I used to live on that street in Athens, and that this is a wonderful market that's been going on for decades, and it just sort of happened when a group of people decided it was going to happen. We can't design that. And again, that's another sort of example of the cosmopolitan canopy. So what I'm saying here is we need to think about these spaces. Some of them we can assist and we can create maybe culturally inclusive spaces, or at best, non-exclusive places. But in other cases, these things happen. And one of the chapters in one of my books by Vikas Mehta talks about street as ecology. not street as physical space, but street as ecology, as a collision of human and other sort of living forms with a physical structure. I want to give you the strange case of Los Angeles in terms of spatial injustice, because it's really interesting. So Los Angeles, car capital, has a complete streets policy. I mean, a lot of these cities like Salt Lake City, like Phoenix, Arizona, like Los Angeles, are trying to reverse car-centric planning. But what's really interesting about LA is it has a complete streets policy, and yet, until October last year, it banned street vendors. Now, to Koreans and to Latinx people, that's what a street is. It's about street vending. How can you have a complete streets policy? As I said in one of my books, can streets in a heavily immigrant metropolis, however multimodal the distribution of lane space, be said to be complete if they fail to include the livelihoods and economic survival of the vendors, the smells, the sights of tastes of homelands, and the places for people to pause and stop? So this was illegal. These were doing illegal things. Luckily, LA backed down on this, but not for the right reason. They backed down when Mr. Trump was elected because they didn't want federal enforcement agents to see these illegal vendors and then have a rationale for going and checking on their papers. So, complete streets. Who gets to decide what a complete street is? That's, in a sense, where I'm going with this. More book opportunities here, folks. So my book is called Incomplete Streets. And again, I'm not denying the value of a complete street. My question is, who gets to decide what one is? Who gets to decide whether Korean, Latino, or whatever vendors get to use the street? Who gets to decide what the narrative is? Who gets to decide on the design of these complete streets? And one of the points in this book series, actually, if any of you have got manuscripts, the book series is called Routledge, Equity, Justice, and the Sustainable City series, and these are 3 of the books in the series. One of the points that we make is that if the complete streets dialogue is missing these equity-based narratives, the policies and plans coming out of complete streets are systematically reproducing many of the urban, spatial, and social inequalities and injustices that have characterized US cities for the last century or more. And one of the books, the book on the far right, Green Gentrification, makes the really good point that in the 40s and 50s in the US, we had what was called redlining, where certain neighborhoods were put, the banks and Housing Loan Corporation put red lines around, and no loans were granted in those neighborhoods. This was racialized. It was called yellow lining or redlining, and it was horrific racist policy. There is ample evidence, though, that complete streets change the socioeconomic nature of the neighborhoods. Walkability, the more walkable your neighborhood, in fact, Redfin have done Redfin is a realty company, and they said that for every 1% rise in walkability of your neighborhood, there's probably about a 1% increase in house prices. So houses in neighborhoods that are much more walkable are much more valuable. Rents go up as walkability increases. Cyclability as well increases rents. Guess who owns the app for walkability and cyclability? Redfin, the real estate agent. We have commercialized sustainability to the point now where the measurement of 2 facets of sustainability, walkability and cyclability, are in the domain of realty companies, estate agents. So I think this green lining, this red lining, this merits further study. I'm not saying that green lining is racist like red lining was. it's a socioeconomic thing. It's the neoliberal state doing what it does best, segregating us out according to income. However, the effects can be racialized as well, certainly in a place like the United States where income and race are so closely related. Very briefly, I just want to talk a little bit about urban parks. And this is Setha Lowe's book, and I know Setha was here. This is a great book, Rethinking Urban Parks, Public Space and Cultural Diversity. Three points from this. She makes a really good point that it's not disuse of parks as another form of public space. It's not disuse, but patterns of design and management of parks that exclude certain people and reduce cultural and social diversity. Why is that important? That's important because of a thing called contact theory. Contact theory is really simple. It says the more contact we have with people who are different to ourselves, the more likely we are to be tolerant and even supporting of policies promoting integration and contact. It's simple. Somebody was probably paid millions of dollars to do the research, but it's actually simple. And in many ways, people have argued that Britain is proof of this. Brexit was not about socioeconomic things, it was about xenophobia and racism. That's what Brexit was about, and the vote reflected that. The big cities were solidly for staying in Europe. Contact in the big cities is pretty common. The places in Britain that voted against were the little rural areas, places where there were very few immigrants, but an over-presence of, racist and xenophobic media. This, I think, is a very good example of how contact theory works. So, streets, parks, we need to make them more spatially just. We need to create spaces of engagement. How do we do that? Can we create cosmopolitan canopies? How do we do that? How do we stop hostile and defensive architecture? How do we do that when developers want us to do that? Do we need urban policies from cities to help on that? So the second area that I want to look at now in a little bit more detail is this idea of culture, difference and diversity. And one of the guiding questions I have is from Wood and Landry, Phil Wood and Charles Landry. At what point do cities start to see diversity as less a cost, a drag on scarce resources and a mind-numbing complexity, and start to see it as a force, a resource and an opportunity? I'm going to go on a limb here. I don't know Stockholm that well. I get the feeling that diversity is seen as a problem in a lot of ways from what I've seen. Something to be managed, something to be manipulated. I don't see a celebration in many ways, and I'll go on to talk about that, and obviously in the questions some of you are going to challenge me on that perhaps, and that's good. But a quick point here. It was about 40 years ago that many large companies, multinationals, started to realize that a diverse workforce was good for two reasons. Number one, it got you into sales areas that you might not get into if you didn't have a diverse workforce. And second, research and development is better with more diverse workforces. There's a journal after journal from business schools showing that basically that R&D works better when you've got a diverse research and development force. Why haven't cities realized this? Why do cities still try to manage diversity rather than use it in creative ways? So I want to really talk about two ways that cities could use and we could use as urban planners. We could use diversity more positively. And I think that this thinking that I do in Just Sustainabilities can help us recognize, understand, and engage difference, diversity, and cultural heterogeneity in inclusive, creative, and productive ways. But the two conditions are that we embrace interculturalism and that we take seriously the need for cultural competency. Interculturalism and cultural competency. another book opportunity. So this is the book that I was mentioning by Phil Wood and Charles Landry, The Intercultural City, Planning for Diversity Advantage. What do I mean by the intercultural as opposed to the multicultural city? Well, the quote that I've taken here, the interculturalist approach goes beyond opportunities and respect for existing cultural difference to the pluralistic transformation of public space, civic culture and institutions. See the importance here of public space, streets, places, parks, markets, the pluralist transformation of public space, civic culture and institutions. Boston is a majority-minority city. You wouldn't know that. I mean, certainly you wouldn't from, watching Cheers, although Cheers I know was in the 1980s. But Boston doesn't market itself as a majority-minority city. Boston has a very careful control of its image. And even though it is majority-minority, its institutions are still the good old boy Irish, Italian-American networks. That's what Boston is. Show me a city that's changed its institutions and its civic culture to reflect the change in its demographics. I don't really know of one. We're not really good at interculturalism in many ways. So the interculturalist approach also aims to facilitate dialogue, exchange, reciprocal understanding between people of different cultural backgrounds. So it's different to multiculturalism. It's a much more active, but it's much more about how do institutions change along with demographic change. And I want to give you an example here, a really good example. This is a great report by Lanfer and Taylor from 2004. The report is called Immigrant Engagement in Open Space, Strategies for the New Boston. And they make a really good point here. The lack of engagement of more recent immigrants in the Friends of the Park organisations and other groups of today has led to concerns that while Olmsted's vision continues to resonate with the many Bostonians, it may not resonate with the majority of those who will decide Boston's future. How do we get organisations to start to look like the communities in which they operate? This is a really important point. And again, I'll come back to it with us as planners. How do we get engagement across difference? So how do we, my question then is, how do we adopt this intercultural approach and how do we engage across difference? And I want to look at some ideas here based on this idea that public space is a really important place to think about how we can get some form of understanding of difference across cultures. And one idea is this idea of familiar landscapes. And in Boston, we have a large Brazilian and Latino community, and the Guatemalan American community is very large in Boston. And there's a particular park and particular parts of the park where the Guatemalans congregate near the willow trees. And the quote here, I think that one of the reasons that place is so popular with us, Latinos, is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herter Park in Boston because it looks like home. The familiarity of a landscape. And I remember this 25 years ago when I was working in the UK, and I had a sort of little bit of a research project called Landscape Links. Landscape links. How do you link landscapes that are familiar from your home to where you are now? Because again, it's a way of getting people out into public spaces. Similarly, through food and food justice, familiar foodscapes, or what the anthropologists call Otto Topographies. And this is a picture here from the former South Central farms in Los Angeles, where this 30-year-old Zapotec woman, she said, I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. I grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. Now, over lunch with Tigran, I was talking about the umbilical link that food has between where you're from and where you are now. And especially if you think about the United States today and the xenophobia against immigrants, food is becoming more important. Food isn't just about nutrition, it's about love, it's about celebration, it's about foodways, celebrating who you are, who you were, who you are now. Food is about passion, food is about culture. So it's all of these different things. And you know, we have this concept in the US at the moment of sanctuary cities, where mayors in large progressive cities are starting to say to the government, we're not going to participate with, enforcement of immigrant documentation, and that's all very well and good, but that's kind of on the back foot. That's saying, that's a reactive thing. I want to see mayors saying, we will protect immigrant foodways. We will provide public space for immigrants to grow food in ways that they've grown it in the past. We will, we will work on restaurants to pay a decent wage, etc., etc. So I think there's many ways that cities can be active in helping belonging, helping engagement through food justice. Another thought about engagement and belonging: can we design in encounter? Can we design landscapes of encounter? And this is, some of you will be familiar with Superkilen Park in Nørrebro in Copenhagen. Sort of linear park, split into different parts. The basic idea here was, let's find out from communities what they would want to see in a park. And they said, what about architects from our own countries? No, artifacts from our own countries. And some people will say, didn't work. Surely this is the right idea, to ask communities what is significant, what would they want other people from other communities to see of their community. So the question here is, can we design in encounter? Can we create inclusive landscapes? There's a very interesting kind of schism here in my own mind. Can we design inclusive landscapes, or, as some Australian research is suggesting, no, we can't design inclusive landscapes, but we can design non-exclusive landscapes? That's an interesting thought, isn't it? It's a difference between designing inclusive landscapes and designing non-exclusive landscapes. Anyway, I think the jury's out on that one. Piece that I'm very, very excited about is some work that has been going on with my friends at the Department of Landscape at Sheffield University. I was there recently for their 50th anniversary, and they have a transnational urban outdoors research group. Claire Rishbeth is the leader of this group. She does what we call deep ethnographies. Forget the design charrettes. Let's get into deep ethnographies. Let's really learn about communities. And I'm going to do something now that is going to depress me. How many people have read that paper? Ethnographic Understanding of Ethnically Diverse Neighborhoods to Inform Urban Design Practice. You see, depressing. None of you have read it. So, that's the journal I edit, Local Environment, the International Journal of Justice and Sustainability. I want you to promise me to read this paper. It's got so much rich ethnographic work in there that will help you thinking about urban design practice in terms of diverse neighborhoods. They have a project called Refugees Welcome in Parks. It's a resource book to look at refugee integration and well-being, how parks and urban public space can be more welcoming to refugees and asylum seekers. They have a project on benches for everyone, solitude in public, sociability for free. These are really important ideas that, I was going to say, responsible urban design departments should be looking at. I think all urban design departments should be looking at these kind of procedures, deep ethnographies, and really thinking about how we can work our practice to the benefit of some of the most deprived people in our society. So the second area, in addition to interculturalism, is cultural competency. I think cultural competencies are essential for planning and policy making in cities. And a definition that myself and a former student came up with: cultural competency is the range of awareness, beliefs, knowledge, skills, behaviour and professional practice that will assist in planning and policy making in, for and with multiple publics. The American Planning Association, Planning Accreditation Board, has very implicit, not explicit, focus on cultural competency. There is no accredited urban planning or design school in the US that has a core curriculum class on cultural competency. Wouldn't you think that, given what I've said about cities of difference and the diversity of our cities, wouldn't you think it should be a priority that urban planners and designers should have a class on cultural competency? If we want the intercultural city, if we want that harmonious city, we cannot leave it to chance. We cannot be laissez-faire about it. Our city building professionals have to be culturally competent. Other urban professionals are. Health and social work both have cultural competency front and centre in their code of practice. Health, given the strong evidence for socio-cultural barriers to care at multiple levels of the healthcare system, culturally competent care is a key cornerstone in efforts to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities in health and healthcare. Couldn't be more explicit. And this has been shown in the US, that basically culturally competent healthcare improves outcomes. The National Association of Social Workers says cultural competency practice objectives are in their code of ethics. And my question for us is, could more culturally competent planning and policy making help eliminate racial, ethnic and cultural disparities in what and how we plan and make policy? I've talked about culturally inclusive design. What about culturally inclusive practice? I mean, I wish my students at Tufts looked like this group of students. I really do, but we find it very hard to get a diverse group of students, and we work really hard at it. And when I was chair of the department, you know, one of very few chairs of African extraction, when I was chair of the department, I had recruited a faculty that was 60% tenured faculty of colour, and we still couldn't recruit minority students. Why? Because we're a private university with high fees, and other universities have much bigger purses, and basically you have to buy students, because a good student from a minority background can go virtually anywhere in the US, and you get Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, any of these schools will offer them a free ride, and we couldn't do that. So, you know, my idea of having a diverse faculty would just attract diverse students. It did, but they didn't come because we couldn't give them the money that they wanted. So I think we need a profession that is A, culturally competent, is B, much more diverse and looking like this group. And yes, you might say, well, there's not much of an age range there. Yes, I would like to see much more of an age range, but we need to see a profession that looks much more like this. Okay, my final set of thoughts is on the idea of sharing cities, which brings together a lot of these earlier thoughts. Book opportunity here, Sharing Cities, A Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities. The claim that we have in this book is that if we could reinvent and revive this idea of sharing, we could enhance equity, rebuild community, and dramatically cut resource use. And that with modern technologies, the intersection of urban space and cyberspace provides an amazing platform for a more inclusive and environmentally efficient sharing economy. But at the moment, really, Is this it? Is it Uber, TaskRabbit, Airbnb? I mean, that's the way that when people talk about sharing, they talk about these three companies or some of the other companies. And, let's face it, I mean, the idea of sharing your car or, oh, I've got a room in my house that I'm not going to use, let me rent it out. That's a great idea. But can these companies be considered sharing economy companies? Is the word sharing really right when these are awash with billions of dollars of venture capital? Is it really about sharing? So there are many, many critiques of the sharing economy, and I'll leave you to take a look. Some of these are a little old now, but there are many, many critiques of the sharing economy. I'm going to go through one or two of them, but I'm also going to put forward a different view about sharing, the idea of the sharing city. But let's start with going back to the future. What was really interesting for both Duncan McLaren and myself, who are essentially geographers and urban planners, was really delving through sort of evolutionary psychology and finding that sharing is an evolutionary trait, that shared efforts allowed our ancestors to band together to hunt, farm, create shelter. We couldn't do things alone. Sharing came before competition in many ways. And it's interesting, I always think about, Darwin's ideas, and if I were to ask, most of you, which of Darwin's ideas they know about. Most people say survival of the fittest. But that's not what Darwin only said. I mean, he talked about the need to be able to live in an ecosystem, to live in a cooperative way. And wouldn't it be amazing if the Victorians had chosen that interpretation of Darwin rather than survival of the fittest? We developed altruism. We developed sharing and cooperation. We had preferences for equity and fair shares. It was much later that competition came in. So we are natural sharers, and that's something that a lot of people, when they read the book, they say, well, Julian, we're not, we compete. Again, in the book, we really take a pot shot at competition. It came much later than the idea of sharing. We wouldn't have been able to survive and to bring down large animals alone. We had to get together in groups to both bring them down and then share the spoils. Let's have a look at the scope of sharing. We share things, cars and tools. We share services, sites for meeting and sleeping, activities, leisure and sports. We share experiences, political activities and leisure. These sharings can be material or virtual, tangible or intangible. Sharing can enable consumption, digital music, or production, community gardens. Sharing can be simultaneous, a public space, sequential, recycling materials, rivalrous, solo use excludes another, such as car share, or non-rivalrous, open source software. We can distribute shares in parts, like a cake, or in turns, like a bike. We can share with other private individuals, in collective groups. We can share as citizens. We could share much more widely, and more often. How do we do that? And one of the things we really look at in the book is, what is the role of municipalities in helping us move towards these sharing cities? Because all of you do some of those. Some of you do more, but we all share in some ways. So let me just take a look now then at the two discourses. One is the sharing economy discourse, and the other is what Duncan and I call the sharing paradigm. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's a couple that are really important. And as you can see, the sharing paradigm is much more about social, cultural, and political activity than just economic activity. The really important ones, though, is the sharing economy is transactional. It's about a transaction, whereas the sharing paradigm is relational. It's about us as human beings, as interdependent and vulnerable people working together for change, rather than as autonomous individuals doing transactions. And that's not to say that market-based solutions might not be the best way to allocate certain resources. But we believe strongly that political and behavioural solutions are the most important ways forward on this. So our sharing paradigm then recognises that there are two axes along which we can think about sharing. On the right-hand side is what we call socio-cultural or evolved sharing. That's the sharing that I was talking about on the savannas, the sharing that was just natural for human survival. On the other side is intermediated or learned sharing, and that's intermediated by by phones. That's app-based sharing. And I'm not making a judgment about which is better or which is worse here. So that's the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, at the bottom, we have commercial or extrinsic sharing. Sharing because, you know, I've got that spare room, I've got that spare seat, and I'm driving to Chicago. That's sharing for, you know, a price. Communal or intrinsic sharing is, you know what, I want to go out and share this because somebody else can use it. You know, I was given it. It's that kind of sharing that makes you feel good about yourself. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we have commercial mediated sharing. That's the sharing economy. Uber, Airbnb, Lending Club, TaskRabbit. Our point in the book, the whole point of the book, is we need to move from the bottom left quadrant up to the top right towards communal socio-cultural sharing. We can also move up towards communal mediated and towards the collaborative economy, but we can't just stay in the sharing economy, which is transactional, and it's about supposedly autonomous individuals. It's not going to get us to where we need to be. So we need to move out of that quadrant, preferably up into the top right, and we need to think about what role local authorities can have. And there are many examples in the book, from Seoul to Amsterdam to Medellin to San Francisco, many examples of different approaches to the sharing city. So adopting this sharing paradigm, we argue, offers cities the opportunity to lead the transition toward just sustainabilities, which offers a radically different vision compared to the global race to the bottom to attract footloose investment capital. And for us, we felt that it really redefines what smart cities of the future might mean, harnessing smart technologies to an agenda of sharing and solidarity rather than one of competition, enclosure and division. And in a sense, the whole point of the book is that we are talking about how do we co-create the urban commons. And I think this is a really good place for the left. We missed the agenda on inequality. We shied away, just like the right shied away from it. We didn't go where we needed to go on inequality. I think reclaiming the urban commons, and I'm not talking about commons as in open spaces necessarily. The urban commons is that collectivity of spaces, whether they are cyber, whether they are real spaces, the spaces of engagement. We need to have our act together on the urban commons. So in the book, we go beyond this sharing economy idea. We explore approaches that are more cultural than commercial, more political than economic, and are rooted in a broad understanding of the city as a co-created urban commons. How do we co-create the urban commons? Just want to get, I've got time, yeah. I want to give you two examples of co-creation, co-production, if you like. The simplest one, my local authority, Cambridge, Mass, were embarking on a big, ambitious street tree planting scheme. And they said, look, folks, we've got the trees, but we can't water them over the summer. And you know, in the urban environment, trees can die because of the impervious nature of blah, blah, blah. Throw a bucket of water over the tree twice a week in the summer. That's co-production. Co-producing the tree. Simple. At another level, co-production works, and this is a healthcare one, but it, I think, gives you an idea of this idea of co-creation, co-production. The second level is there's one medical centre in Lehigh, Pennsylvania. If you are discharged having had certain procedures, you won't be followed up by a doctor or a nurse, but by a person that's had the same procedure as you. So, hands up if you think recovery times are better or worse for not seeing a doctor or nurse. Are recovery times better if you see somebody who's had the same procedure as you? Yes, they absolutely are. What's the word? What can the person who's had the same procedure as you give you that the doctor and nurse can't give you? Empathy. You get empathy. And empathy is such a powerful driver for recovery. So again, urban commons, it could be health related, it could be street tree related, but it's a way of thinking about our interactions with each other and spaces that is productive and stimulating. We have plenty of examples of cities that are producing policies around co-creating the urban commons. I'm on the board of directors of Shareable, based out of San Francisco, and the book on the left, again, free download, Policies for Shareable Cities, a sharing economy policy primer for urban leaders, and more recently, Sharing Cities, Activating the Urban Commons, which is a more practical, examples-based version of mine and Duncan's book. Again, free download from the Shareable website. So we have the policies, we have the examples and where they're working. So to my favourite city that I haven't been to, Tigran, you and I, we got to go there. We got to go to this place. Medellin, Colombia. Anybody been? I haven't been, but the more I read about it, the more I'm really interested. So, a couple of things here. Building an urban commons. So they don't use the word sharing cities, but they talk about building an urban commons. They talk about social urbanism. And I'm going to go into that in a minute. But what they do that's most exciting is they focus their projects, like this library park, award-winning architecture, they focus them in the poorest areas, in the communas on the hillside. So they've focused on creating an urban commons by reconnecting the hillsides, the poorest people, to the downtown through very ambitious public transit. So on the top right, you have some of the metro cable systems. You can see them on the bottom right as well. You can see the Parque Biblioteca here on the left. Focusing on the poorest neighbourhoods first. And I just want to give you 2 points here. This philosophy of social urbanism from the Medellin Academy, empowering citizens but focusing on the poorest neighbourhoods first. The city's plan says public space and infrastructure must be the framework where education and culture are cultivated in places of encounter and coexistence. What have I been talking about? Encounter and coexistence. Medellin gets it. How do we recreate an urban commons, a shared space, a shared vision? Now, it's not perfect, and colleagues of mine have said gentrification is rampant in parts of Medellin. But at least they have a philosophy that is driving something that is helping to make change in a city that has, remember, this was the city, for those of you who don't watch Narcos, this was the city from the early 1980s that was the cocaine capital of the world. If ever there was an urban transformation, surely it is Medellin, Colombia. Some of the amazing things they can do are participatory budgeting, participatory planning. They do benefit, I have to say, with a huge amount of money from their own public utility. And that gives, I think, 30% of its pre-tax profits to fund these kind of projects. So let me summarize. Managing our coexistence in shared space, that has got to be our goal. How do we better manage our coexistence in shared space? And not just manage it because we want lowest common denominator kind of approach, manage the tedium, but manage it in a positive way. How do we foster belonging, recognition, difference, diversity and inclusion, as well as thinking about what cities can become, smart, sharing, sustainable? How do we engage intercultural, culturally competent planning and policy making? And how do we practice humane-scaled and human-scaled urban planning and design? And just leaving you with a hopeful note, here's some hostile defensive architecture in Manchester, where the city had put studs along a bench to stop homeless people sleeping, and a woman and her kids made some cushions, left some cookies, left some flowers there. That's humane scaled interaction. Thank you.
I like the role I have here because I'm not a real moderator. I'm just a transferable person transferring things. It's amazing. I felt like a number of theses have been born here, a number of paper ideas, a couple of research projects, and maybe a book.
Ah.
And you'll probably get some credit for it, for sure. Some ideas will be morphed and pinched, but that's what happens. Beautiful. So I would invite Karin, Matthias, and Andy to the bar chairs.
So thank you for a very rich talk. I have two sort of main comments, and the first one would be, I think, what you talked about in terms of making spaces, urban spaces, more inclusive and sort of making space for intercultural meetings and so on. I mean, for sure, that is very important and very challenging. But something we have observed in Sweden and could also be seen in several other countries is another strategy to this, which is maybe more that this attempt at making sort of inclusive spaces has often failed, and so there is rather a strategy to target a specific space for a group, for a specific group, and for a disadvantaged group. For instance, there's a famous project in Malmö called Rosens röda matta, which is specifically designed for young women or young girls, basically with immigrant background, because they tend to underuse public space. And even if you design for everyone, it will be taken over by the guys and they will not feel welcome. So it would be interesting to hear your reflection on this kind of strategies where we really target one group, and also separatist spaces, which is coming up also, often not from the public authorities, but from sort of groups themselves, that we want a separatist space, for instance, women only in certain neighborhoods. How to deal with this? I mean, there are both strengths and perhaps problems with them as well.
Great question. No silver bullet, absolutely no silver bullet solution here. And, and I always preface my point by saying, can we create inclusive spaces? And then I mentioned the Australian research, which says probably not. We should aim for non-exclusive spaces. And then we have the idea of separatist spaces. I think, when we think about multiple use of spaces, sports fields, and we've thought about this a lot, and maybe we have to think about multiple cultural ways of looking at space. One of the things that worries me is when you look at it, we have this concept of universal design, and people say, we've got universal design. We just do this, we do this, we do this. Universal design is about ability and disability. It was never designed around cultural needs or gendered needs or those different kinds of needs. So I just want to open up a wider conversation, I think, around around the way that we look at spaces. Who's designing some of these spaces? I mean, for most part, the designers of these spaces do not look like the communities in which they live. And I can see the need for separatist spaces. I mean, as long as those separatists are not for hateful means. But I can see gendered spaces. I can see that, Muslim women might need spaces. The progressive authority, the culturally competent authority, the authority that has amassed design and planning individuals who look like the communities would be best placed to work with communities to decide on what that suite of spaces look like. And remember, I quoted Doreen Massey, places are the result of social relations through time. Places change, neighborhoods change. And so, we mustn't see places as fixed, so we must see them as fluid as well. And again, that goes against a lot of what we've thought about in terms of parks planning. Our parks have been very fixed spaces. Maybe we need a new way of looking at them. I mean, I was thinking about this in terms of national parks. I think of, and I don't know so much about Swedish national parks, but I do know about British national parks and Canadian and US national parks. I mean, the words jewel in the crown are often applied to national parks. But when you think about the ideology behind national parks, certainly British national parks, the idea is the Judeo-Christian ideal of wandering, solo, contemplation, meditation. My wife's from the Dominican Republic. You don't do that. The park is a place for sociability, to eat, to play music. How are our national parks going to change to reflect new immigrants? Are they going to change? Are we going to see national parks? I know it's a different space, but national parks are an even more embedded. They're embedded in the national psyche. They will probably be the last spaces to change, because in changing them, you are tampering with the national psyche. And that's something that, some people will really not like. But maybe we have to think about this. How are some of our gems of nature going to change to reflect what new communities want? It's going away from your point a bit, but I'm just trying to make this wider point that we really are going to need to think very, very broadly about public space, access, separation or inclusion, non-exclusion. All of these things, I think, but these are not even questions that some people are asking, I think, Karen. I do want to go and see this place in Malmö, though. I really would like to take a look at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julian. It was a bit overwhelming because there were so many different things you brought up. I was thinking, in the beginning, you spoke quite a lot about the importance of, about the relations between the social sides and the ecological sides of sustainability, and I'm not so sure I think that's needed. I was a bit surprised that you spent that focus on it, so I think I'll have my first question on that. My impression is that, first of all, you said in this book from 2002, you really made a statement there that both sides are important, and my impression is that had been like that for at least 15 years. My first paper in a scientific journal was called Sustainable Development Principles. A good start, I guess, to write a paper on. But there we highlighted this very much, and that was to a great extent just a summary of of what was already going on. So it was by no way our idea. But that's, I guess, the whole point with sustainable development.
Yeah, but the point I was making was that the whole book was about equity and social justice and sustainable development. There are many books about sustainable development that have, a chapter on equity and social justice. Okay. And just on that, what's really interesting, is, the first time I read the phrase sustainable development was in the World Conservation Strategy, 1980. And, there was an equity deficit in much of the writing, and there is, there's often that chapter where equity and social justice perhaps are addressed, but have never been the focus of an integrative approach to equity and social justice and living within limits. That was the point.
I appreciate that answer a lot, because I think that is much more important than the actual definition that you presented. So maybe I got too much focused on that definition, because I think the novelty is, I can imagine that is the focus.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thanks for your talk. I've seen you many times speak, and maybe known you for 15 years now, and so it's great to see the evolution of just sustainabilities, but also that same core ideas that you started with, but extending those to contemporary debates. I do work now on smart cities, and I think
you're right in characterizing smart cities from this sharing economy type of setup rather than a sharing paradigm. I think that's when we look at smart solutions, they're often about the sharing economy. But it's interesting that we also use the word co-creation quite a bit in smart cities. And the idea is that you have to have this quadruple helix of different partners, right? So you've got the public sector, you've got academics, you've got the private sector, and you need to have citizens or residents. Yeah. And what we see is that co-creation process doesn't usually work very well. So I wonder, do you feel like with urban planning, with urban design, do we need to go to very strong participatory planning types of approaches that we've been talking about since the 60s, since the 70s? Or is it better for planners and designers to not try to design in inclusive, diverse spaces and instead try to design out inequality, but then let them flourish on their own? So I guess it's more about the planning process. How do we design cities? Do we do a formal participatory process, or is it something else?
Great question, and I'm going to use an example here. It's not quite a smart city example, but it's a sort of sharing economy, sharing cities example. But I think it gets to one of your points. So I've been contacted lots of times recently, over the last year or so, by urban bike share groups in the United States, saying, Julian, we've been running our bike scheme now for 3 years. We're wildly successful, much more than we projected, but you know what? Very few low income and very few minorities are riding our bikes. I get this a lot. And I say, so what are you basing this notion of success on if basically a large proportion of the city's population is not using your bikes? Well, here's the issue. Number one, they never consulted, most cities never consulted other than their own little group of people who are bike users. The business model was based around commuters, and the locations were based around commuters and tourists. So the locations were never in lower income neighborhoods. So I challenged these groups. I said, what would a bike share scheme look like if it were designed around the needs of low income and minority people? What would it look like? And again, I wasn't proposing an answer, but I was challenging them to think about it. In some ways, the dockless bikes now in the US, there's a lot of evidence that dockless bike schemes are being much more widely used by a wide group of people. But I think, to get to your point, unless we design our smart cities, our sharing cities, with social justice and equity in there from the beginning, we're not going to get there. In one particular blog piece, I talked about these bike companies as trying to retrofit equity and justice. They're trying to retrofit equity and justice once the business model that they've already got in place is up and running. It's very difficult to retrofit equity and social justice when that wasn't the original goal. And, but one example of smart city technology that I think inadvertently has benefited lower income and certainly minority people that I've seen is a really simple one. Real-time bus information. who uses, certainly in the United States, who uses buses? And this is an example of smart city technology that has disproportionately benefited people on low incomes and minorities. They can organise themselves now and knowing that a bus is coming at a certain time rather than standing around waiting. Also, it's actually upped ridership amongst some people who maybe wouldn't use buses, because now they know when a bus is coming and they don't have to stand around and wait. So, not perfect answer to your question, but I think embedding social justice and equity in smart city and sharing city thinking, and then an example there of a smart technology that has been developed, not with the focus on social justice, but has had a huge social justice effect.
Actually, your answer was part of my question connected to this, because I know Karin has worked with sharing economies. Matthias works with with living labs. You with the experimentation cities or researching into it. But it's like, how can you work against projects that are designing lifestyles, almost giving you what you have dreamt of? And then,
Well, so there was an op-ed in the Boston Globe written by you-know-who talking about from lifestyles to livelihoods. Why are we so obsessed with designing lifestyle improvements for people that already have a good lifestyle? Surely some of our super smart geeks could come up with livelihood improvements. What would that look like? How could an app help people, whose livelihood is being challenged? And I'll give you an example of an app that was a lifestyle app that offended a lot of people. So has anybody come across the app called Bodega? Bodega is an app in the United States for these lockers that are being placed in gyms, in offices, in the hallways of high-end condos, and you can basically unlock it and get food, little bits of things, health foods. But the word bodega has a very specific meaning to Puerto Rican and Dominican people. These were places in New York City that were places where they had to go to shop because other shopkeepers wouldn't sell to them. And they became social spaces. So they had so the bodega was where you went to find out what was going on. It's offensive to a lot of people that an app for a lifestyle is now, has appropriated a livelihood. And, that's just an example. But, I don't mind the idea of, wealthy people having access to these little cupboards, basically. But it's cultural appropriation to call them bodegas when a bodega has a very specific meaning to certain cultural groups in the United States. So I think, though, in general, we'll always have lifestyle apps. We'll always have them because people will pay for them and they generate income. But surely we can create livelihood apps. So we need to move towards more livelihood-based apps. What would these look like? I don't know. But you know what? Some people do know. And those are people who are living in lower income neighborhoods, etc. Where we have, in Boston, we have an innovation district in downtown, and we have one in a lower income community that looks very much like Tiensta. Where do you think most of the money goes in terms of innovation and R&D? There are people in the Roxbury neighborhood in Boston who would love to get in on innovations and development and are bright people, but they're not getting that exposure. So, so again, I think this idea of, livelihood improvement as opposed to just focusing on lifestyles would go a long way to decreasing inequality and creating employment opportunities, and also making people feel good that they can come up with solutions to particular issues in their neighborhoods.
Great, thanks. Karin had a comment on that.
I'm thinking about the figure you showed about the sharing economy,
Yeah.
collaborative economy, and so on. I was thinking about the strategic thinking about making this figure, because I mean I totally understand the point of it, and but there is something with it that you also leave the sharing economy to the commercial sphere, in a sense, where there are many of the sort of the early phases of sharing actually were non-commercial, and then it was kind of hijacked or I mean drawn towards the big sort of the big capital, and also some that wouldn't even be. I mean, I know you're familiar with this, but you know the distinction between gig economy and sharing economy. Actually, Uber has never ever been sharing economy. It's always been more or less gig economy. So isn't there a point, my question, to actually include some of what you see as the collaborative economy, more collaborative, cooperative, commoning practices in the sharing economy? Because since the sharing economy still has such a whatever hype, or there's such an interest in it, in for sort of investment for public authorities to, you know, advance, to connect to smart cities, if you make this division, isn't there a risk of, you know, that you it could be strategic to actually include or see the digital sort of innovation aspects also in the sort of collaborative and commoning? All of this has much longer sort of historical traditions.
Can I add something which is almost the same, because I think it's kind of a similar question, because I was also a bit intrigued by I like the setup, but then you said that we should strive for heading up in the northeast direction, up and right, and I was thinking, isn't it? But then you added, it's also important to see what the role of the municipality would be. Couldn't you just as well think of the role of the municipality in each of those four? I think it becomes, because maybe sometimes it's better to walk in the other direction, and I think it's related to the question there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I have a limited amount of time, and as you, by definition, said, I did pack a lot in. Any schema like that is a simplification, and you know, and to your point, and then I'll come back to yours as well. Yes, in every sector of that diagram, we see a role for the local government. I mean, belatedly, they're all now trying to regulate Airbnb and to regulate Uber. What we propose in the book is that instead of, you know, always being reactive, when are cities going to become proactive and start to work with these? This economy is not going to go away. When are they going to start working with these companies? And Boston is starting to do that now. We've passed some of the most, advanced we are about to pass some of the most advanced legislation. But other cities, Berlin, Amsterdam, Reykjavik, I'm pretty sure Stockholm, I don't know. But, you know, so we are now working. But I think you're right. In every sector, we need local authorities to not look at this as an adversarial relationship, but to look at it as an opportunity for diversification of local economies. Absolutely, we do. The only reason, I emphasize that top right-hand corner is that is the collective commons. That is where trust and empathy and altruism, that's where we're going to get that. I mean, so there's the city of Seoul has done an inventory of its resources that have downtime that could be used by local people. Now, horrible example, but there's a lot of parking lots that after 5 or 6 o'clock are empty. City council parking lots that council workers use. So the city's allowing people to use those. Now, not a good example because encouraging driving, but I could think of, how many of our cities do we know that have inventoried what is shareable, within their sort of resource constraints? So on the one hand, I can see cities having a role in all of those sectors. On the other hand, to your point, I mean, most people think this is a pretty useful way of looking at the, you know, for academics like yourself who've really studied in detail, there are lots of little flaws in here. But I think for most people who look at it as a general guide and then about the need to move away from solely focusing our efforts on sharing at the sharing economy, I think it seems to work.
Sort of a related question, I think. I was interested that you used the word civic commons, and I heard the word community used a lot, and the word I didn't hear used a lot was neighborhood. And I know that a lot of your examples were about cities, but you were really talking about smaller areas within cities. And I was wondering, does neighborhood exclude, or is it about being neighborly? Is it about sharing? Is it about exchange? And can we think of cities as a collection of neighborhoods, or does that have detrimental effects?
No, I mean, you know, I do use the word neighborhood. I mean, complete streets is usually a neighborhood-based approach. Yeah, I think it was an error of omission, really, Andy, rather than me changing my focus. But yeah, no, neighborhood is fine. Yeah.
And does civic commons?
Is that civic commons the idea? I can see how that would resonate with policymakers, with planners. But if you talk to a resident or a citizen on the street and you say, "What do you think about the civic commons?" and they say, "I don't know what you're talking about."
Yeah, I mean, no, language is really important. You know, extremely important. I'm desperately trying to think of some things I've been thinking about recently about the way. Oh yeah, so I'm living at the moment on my sabbatical in Montreal. And a fascinating city, Montreal, for a whole host of reasons. The city transport is called STM, Société Transport Montréal. And then underneath it says Mouvement Collectif. And I was thinking about this word, collective. Wow. We don't use it in English or American English, because, and certainly not in the United States, because the word, you're nodding, what does the word collective smack of?
Socialism.
Socialism, yeah, exactly. But in good old Quebec, they use the word collective movement. Collective movement, I like it. So I've been thinking a lot about words and the way we use words, and the way we maybe have to recapture some words. I mean, we are talking about the collective commons. We are talking about this collectivity called the neighborhood, or this collectivity of people or places. You know, we need to reclaim, I think, certain words. And in some languages, these words are, you know, taboo. Another word, coexistence. So in English, coexistence is this kind of kumbaya word, isn't it? It's very desirable. But again, my wife, who's Dominican, who's a native Spanish speaker, she said, "Oh my God, coexistencia is not the same in Spanish. In Spanish, it means kind of being forced to live." Are there any native Spanish speakers here? Yeah, so what does coexistencia mean in Spanish?
Coexistence in Spanish is try to be tolerant with all of the people.
Exactly. It's about tolerating. Whereas we see coexistence as much more than tolerating. Coexistence is thriving with. So again, I think the language of sustainability has to be context specific. And so civic commons, yes, with certain people, but no with others. Yeah.
Speaking of language, before I give the word to
Yeah.
unpacking density context, there was something beautiful you took up, fostering belonging.
Yes.
And this reminds me of our good friend Dan Solomon, who I always say is the finest social soul of new urbanism. There are not too many of them, but he is, and he always talked about longing to belonging, of the refugees especially coming in. And then you showed, and you were a little bit between when you show the park in Copenhagen, can we really design if a tree from Canada is there, can a Canadian feel, or an Iranian maybe bench? And Dan always said everything starts from the house and it goes to the regional scale.
Yeah.
So how do we not solve it? How do we work with that?
I talked about familiarity, didn't I? This idea of familiarity and the Guatemalans liking the banks of the River Charles in Boston because of the willows, and how people find familiar landscapes. And so, from the house is one thing, but familiarity is also from the heart, in a sense. So house and heart, I think, are similar in this kind of way. Everybody's looking for belonging. He said, longing for belonging. Maybe we can design for belonging, but at least we should design, for, to stop. How am I going to say this? At least we should design in ways that allow people to, interpret the way they want to belong. Too much of our design, though, as I showed, was hostile, defensive. We need to stop doing that, and we need to give people ways of thinking about how they can belong. And it might be through food, it might be through familiar landscapes, it might be through a whole range of stuff. But we need to be open to that. And what would greatly assist that is if those gatekeepers in local authorities looked more like the communities that are coming to cities now. They don't look like that. So we have largely white gatekeepers saying this goes or that goes, or this is the way we do things. I mean, our US building codes and planning codes are riven with cultural insensitivity. One example, great example. In Vancouver, they've got this crisis, whole of the western coast of the United States and up through Vancouver. Crisis with what are called monster homes. That's what the planners are calling them. Extended family homes for multi-generational, largely Chinese and other Asian families. So building right up to the plot line, getting rid of the yard because the Chinese don't so much favour the yard, they want more home space. But our building codes militate against this. And yet, analysis has shown that this is probably a better, a more efficient way for people to live, because then those people don't become dependent on services later in life, etc., etc. But most of the planners aren't Chinese Americans. Most of the planners are white middle-class planners who've come up through this very rigid system, and so don't have a cultural awareness about these new groups that are moving in and making demands on our planning system. And that happens in a country that has a policy on multiculturalism, like Canada, or one that's more laissez-faire, like the United States. Again, right down to the detail of our building codes, our sort of practices, they're riven with cultural insensitivity. How do we change that? Well, we got to have a planning and urban design profession that looks more like the people that are coming into neighborhoods.
Wonderful. Now we have time for max 4 questions.
Thanks for a really rich and talk and discussion. I wanted to pick up on your one of the examples you drew upon relating to tree planting and landscapes, and it picks up on this idea of the language we use. So you framed the community-based watering of trees as co-production. And I'm wondering, happens to be like one of my main trajectories of research. And I'm wondering if it's co-production or maybe coercion. And the reason why I raise that question is because in the US, we have a very strong stewardship sort of ethic. But based on my experience here in Sweden, for example, and I would love to put it out there, how likely is it to get a Medelsvensson to go out and plant or to water trees on a public landscape? Very unlikely, right? Because here, that's the rightful responsibility of the state. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder sometimes in these large-scale tree planting campaigns that we're witnessing in North America, if this, get your thoughts on this idea of sort of putting the responsibility of management of this infrastructure that happens to be green, but it's nevertheless infrastructure, onto private citizens.
Sure. These are context-specific ideas. Living in Montreal this year, the snow is cleared from the sidewalks. In the US, you clear the snow from the sidewalks. And I'm not talking about large-scale tree planting. I'm talking about the tree outside your house, the one tree, not large-scale, So I think there's a very different ethic. And let me go to the other example of co-production that I talked about the Lehigh Regional Medical Center. And if you go home having had one of a set of procedures, you will be followed up by a person who's had that procedure, not by a doctor or a nurse. Now, if you were in Britain, if you were a British audience, you'd say, I want to see a doctor or a nurse. This is austerity cuts. That's why you're making me see a person who's not qualified. That's what I got when I mentioned this in Britain. It's not what works. You're just making cuts. That's why I'm not seeing a doctor. So I think the national psyche, the national political milieu will dictate what is seen as legitimate co-production and what is seen as, hey, they haven't got a doctor or a nurse, so I've got to see, Mrs. Jones. I don't want to see Mrs. Jones. I want to see Dr. Such and Such. So again, I think, as you said it, the state has a set of responsibilities that are, either negotiated or not. Different places have different takes on that, and for most Americans, just throwing a bucket of water would not be seen as coercion. But this is not large-scale tree planting. This is just street trees.
Yeah. Thank you for a lovely speech. My question is about what I think is one of the more burning issues when it comes to equality and spatial justice, because it's about the access to internet. And what we have seen here in Sweden is that like free Wi-Fi, for instance, in areas where you don't have such a high income, that's a very crucial thing. And it's much more used in these areas, like Helsingborg, for instance. And when they looked at that, the results, that was much more used in just areas, so to speak. This is also connected to smart cities, of course. But I think this is like a really big issue, because this is actually separating people really much these days, even more than like the spatial justice. It's just expanding into these devices also. Yeah.
Well, Nana, you raise a great point. A couple of thoughts here. I mentioned, early on in my piece, the intersection of urban space and cyberspace. So we can think of, internet and, net neutrality as being essential to the urban commons. That's part of the urban commons. The urban commons isn't just the visible, it's also the digital. And there is, actually, I just heard about a group in the US that's talking about, digital and electronic justice, precisely for the reasons that, that you're talking about. So yes, I think that there are many forms of inequality and inequity. In Seoul is digital and broadband access. In Medellin, the same thing. Those library parks have, routers around the park so that people can get digital access. I'm not sure about actual devices, whether the devices are provided, but there's certainly, it's brought broadband to large parts, free broadband to large parts of the communists. So, but a great point. I mean, I think, in another expanded talk, I talk more about access, and that's not just access to spaces, it's access to resources, cultural, digital, electrical. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Well, hello. Thank you for your presentation. I will apologize for not using Twitter and not being able to share everything you publish. And my question is about this more at a global level. Isn't all this what we're talking about, this sustainability at a city level, at a community level, at the expense of other people on this planet? Our access to ICTs and internet causing harm in other places? And because when I think of just sustainability, of justice, of equity, I always think it at a global level. I come from France, I come from Lebanon, I come from Germany, many places, and we don't have access to the same rights, materials, resources, and I thought that would be maybe a bit lacking in your view, but it's maybe because also I'm not an urban planner and I don't look at the city, but I tend to work at a global level. So what would be your input on justice, sustainability at a global scale and not at a community level?
Yeah, no, you raise some great points there, and you're quite right, though. My focus is on the city. I mean, the city is the new unit of responsibility. Cities are taking responsibility for climate action. Nations are not. Many nations are not. Cities are thinking about a whole range of responsibilities that they have, whereas some nations are not. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at where most digital waste, most laptops they end up at a very specific place in Ghana, in Accra, in Ghana. We are offloading some of the products of our society. And in fact, one thing about the environmental justice movement in the US, it's been so successful in kicking the crap out of communities in the US that the stuff now goes abroad. And so we are just offshoring our problems, which is I think a very big problem from a just sustainability standpoint. And again, in another talk, I do talk on a more global level about just sustainabilities, but really for this one and for an urban planning, urban design school, I really just focused in on the sort of city and metropolitan level. But I take your points, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you want to, for me, some of the nicest work on just sustainabilities, although she doesn't use that term, is Kate Raworth's work on donut economics. Have people heard of the donut economics idea? Although I've often asked Kate, why do you use the word donut for something that's supposed to be healthy and life-affirming and about living with human dignity within environmental limits? But for those of you who don't know about it, the idea is that the outside edge of the donut is the environmental ceiling, the inner ring of the donut is the social foundation, and the idea is we mustn't breach environmental limits on the outside, but we mustn't let people fall below the social foundation. So the safe and humane operating space for humanity is keeping within the donut. And again, she could have used bagel or something like that. A bagel's a little bit more edifying than a donut. It's catchy, yes.
Sorry, we can't offer donuts or bagels. Okay, I think, closer. I think we're never going to saturate any of these issues, but we've opened a wonderful box, and I think this will come sort of try to close it down. I would like to thank foremostly Julian for coming here.
Thank you.
Yeah. And now we can take this opportunity to, Julian, actually present you with something. Our center has the right from KTH to issue an award.
Oh.
Of course, everybody can issue awards, but it doesn't matter. In a sense, this is because you're also on our academic board, but we are selected 8 very special scholars in, I guess, our lifetime of the center to give this award to, and this is the so-called Athena City Accolade for the fighters of the city, more or less. So this is for you.
So over lunch, Tigran said, Julian, I can't wait to tell you this. I'm going to give you an award. But look surprised. So, oh, Tigran, I didn't know you cared so much.
Yeah.
Oh,
and there's
Tigran.
a little statue also of Athena, and it's not real gold, but it's an original.
you.
It's actually made in Greece, which is good for Greek economy. It's not in China.
Oh.
So which goes with the.
Well,
with the,
thank
with
you
this
very
one.
much, Tigran.
Sure, thank you.
Honored.
Yeah. And I would also like to thank our wonderful panel, Andy, Matthias, and Karin, for really enriching this discussion even more. And thank you all for coming on a Friday evening with the World Championships in full force. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.